I know it's tricky sometimes switching the input capture, but I will keep talking so you can see that it's working, so you know which one to pick. Cool. All right, sounds good. And just double checking, I have half an hour, just to kind of gauge the amount of time for the. Okay, cool. And I may have some opportunities for questions throughout, just to level set on sort of, yeah, there's a number of concepts we'll cover throughout the course of the presentation, and a few of them are down some sort of governance or crypto rabbit holes. So if anything is too deep, feel free to note the question, and I'll try to stop throughout, so that we can have some questions or clarifications throughout. So I took a bit of liberty on the topic of this presentation. This is actually one that I gave at a ReFi on conference earlier this spring, contrasting sort of the Silicon Valley move fast and break things with potentially more responsible move slow and fix things mentality, and how we can design tools for flow. Incentive alignment is, of course, a very big aspect of that in Web3 enabled organizations. And in particular, we'll look at the common stack design pattern and a number of the tools and components that can come together into what we call cyber physical commons. So first off, sort of understanding what the problem is in the world today. I believe one of the big parts of it is economic monocultures. So economic monocultures, like any monocultures, are brittle and lack resilience. So if you think of monocrop agriculture, you have forest fire risk, pest risks, sort of the ecosystem responding to an overabundance of one type of resource or commodity basically edges out others, and you get all these weird effects. You get booms and busts in crops. You get booms and busts in markets. And I think a lot of the sort of type cycles that we see in the economy is because we have these monolithic state-enforced, essentially economic monocultures. And what crypto ultimately offers, and all DLTs, is this sort of opportunity for economic permaculture. So we have these diverse local economic networks rather than massive imposed economic networks. They're more bottom up. They can be purpose driven. They can be balanced and hedged. And most importantly, they can sort of bring collective empowerment or self-sovereignty back to communities who can issue and trade their own economic units. Also, I think when we're designing economies, it's really important for us to look at the economies that do work in the world, and apply some economic biomimicry. In particular, I think mushrooms and mycelial networks are a very great example of this. So on the left, you can see this is a page from Mycelium Running by Paul Stamets, where he analyzes the structure of mushrooms and compares it with different network structures like that of dark matter. Or on the right here, we have some economic networks. This is some of the modeling and simulation we did with the Gitcoin grants network. So you can see a lot of the similarities, but ultimately I think we need to design these systems in ways such that they emulate the sustainable patterns we see in nature, and stop imposing sort of a human economy on the natural world, because this is basically the primary thing that's driving us towards this cliff of climate change, resource depletion, and potentially worse. So in the world today, we kind of live in this two-bit democracy. We call one person, one vote representative democracy systems democratic. They're not in any way. We have essentially a two-bit democracy. Every 4 years, we input a 1 or a 0 or a couple of 1s and 0s into a system, and then we go away for 4 years until we're asked again to give input into this societal scale signal processing system that we call politics. And ultimately, I think what we need to do is move to information age signal processing systems. And again, this is a mycelial network, and this is the transfer of information through that mycelial network. So this could be electrical impulses, carbon or other resources. Mycelial networks are actually really great resource distribution and distributed systems as well. There's no brain of a mushroom. that's moving things around. These things just happen sort of emergently through the network. So I think with tokens and these self-sovereign economic networks, we can start to emulate these more natural signal processing systems, giving people more intensity of preference rather than just being able to say yes or no to something. They can say how much they support something or how much they're against it. And these new sort of technological infrastructures allow us to use these rich temporal data streams to help steer our institutions and our society in ways that are much more responsive and adaptive to the needs and challenges of the time. So ultimately, we need better collective decision making as communities, as institutions, and as a society. And a lot of the time, we see that our own institutions are kind of fighting against the solutions that are available to us. So ultimately, I think what this technology offers is the ability to empower localized problem solving, particularly at the edges of a network, which is what mycelium is so good at. And using these incentive mechanisms, coordination mechanisms for adaptive collective action. For anyone who's looked into sort of systems design, definitely recommend reading Donella Meadows. Thinking in Systems is one of her seminal works, and she talks about leverage points in a system. And there are leverage points that are more sort of impactful, and there are leverage points that are less impactful in changing a system. So, I mean, often, when we're talking about tax rates or whatever else, we're kind of talking about the parameters of a system. Should we tax people more? Should we tax people less? And this is where a lot of the, system change discussions are in real world political systems, but it's actually quite low on sort of the leverage points in terms of how we can make change. And we see towards the sort of heavier end, looking at the structures and the rules of the system. What are the goals of these systems and our mindsets? I think there's a lot that we can sort of play with these new tools that give us more leverage over systems change than we have a lot of the time in real world economic systems. So ultimately, what are we trying to do? At the Commons Stack, we're trying to reinvigorate the Commons with a cyber-physical toolkit. So cyber-physical systems are complex systems that involve internet-enabled technology and humans. So you can think of, for example, international power grids. Power grids are cyber-physical systems because we don't have full understanding of how they will operate at any given time, because anyone may plug in or unplug something, and the network has to be load balanced to make sure that there is enough energy being produced to meet the needs, but not more. So there's kind of this dynamic balance going on in cyber physical systems, and this is a very well-established sort of design, control theoretic design space. So what we're trying to do is bring some of that cyber physical systems design into maintaining and empowering local commons. They're producing value in whatever way is deemed important to a local community. And ultimately, the tools that we're building will help communities raise and allocate funding, make decisions together, and measure impact. And we kind of propose commons as these, as opposed to DAOs, are very sort of up until today, these cold, hyper-financial coordination systems. Commons are warm, human-centered, and purpose-driven collective organisms. So at least the minimum viable commons proposed by the Commons Stack has these 4 components. We've got the augmented bonding curve, also called the commons market maker, which is providing funding. The Giveth DApp was proposed as an accountability or escrow mechanism. Governance or decision making is done by conviction voting, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then, of course, the citizens of any given community need to understand what is being accomplished in their community, what is money being spent on, and we propose this commons analytics dashboard. So the idea is that there's these composable pieces that can come together and be fit into larger sort of commons ecosystems. And of course, those 4 pieces aren't the only pieces. There's likely a huge toolkit that it's a huge open design space. You could have different governance tools, funding tools, proposal tools, analytics tools. We also propose some initialization tools in complex systems. It's important to start with trusted initial conditions. So the trusted seed has been something that the Commons Stack has been working on, a community of sort of purpose-aligned philanthropists that can participate in the early stages of these systems the trust of the participants, knowing that these aren't pump and dump people. They're not here for to make a ton off your token. They want to see your project succeed. They want to see these kinds of public goods delivered to the world. And a lot of these components actually ended up in the One Hive Gardens ecosystem, which is a no-code DAO launcher on Gnosis chain. So if you want to play with the augmented bonding curve or conviction voting or any of the other tools that we talked about today, they're currently live in some sort of reference implementation in One Hive Gardens and Gardens DAOs. So if we kind of look at this system from the top down and say, what do these components fit together to do? So you can see the different components here. We've got the augmented bonding curve, the conviction voting, the proposal engine kind of holds funds until work is completed. When work is completed, then value is delivered. So actually, this is kind of the system diagram. I like to make it a little more visual. So I just kind of put the main purpose of each of these areas. The bonding curve is funding, conviction voting is decision making, giveth is payment escrow, work is produced here. But if we even go simpler than that, we can think of the funding. Bonding curve is kind of like the heart of this organism. It pumps the liquidity or the value around the organism. Conviction voting is kind of like its brain. What do we spend money on as a collective? Do we want to fund, military? Do we want to fund healthcare? Do we want to fund, the production of open source code? It's completely up to us. And this is sort of the mechanism by which this organism or community decides how to spend its funds. The escrow is kind of like the stomach. How does money flow into this system and how does that get turned into value? And of course, the value that comes out, like any organism produces outputs. Maybe for an open source community, that could be open source code. And this output is very fertile because what can happen potentially with that open source code is it could get monetized and you could grow a garden from it. Perhaps maybe you put a license on some part of your code, or you create some sort of subscription for funding more of your code. So you're using the outputs of this community, maybe in a user-facing product. Some of that revenue flows back to the community. So you're kind of treating like the bonding curve is like this meal. Capital flows into the project through this. Donations are kind of like a snack. We can keep these organisms healthy through donations, also through feeding back the revenue that's created. So we're kind of looking at this from a organism perspective and how these different components fit together into sort of different parts of a collective intelligence organism. Are we set up well for questions? Are there any questions so far? I just wanted to throw it out there before I dive into the specifics of any. I'll go into the bonding curve a little bit. I'll go into conviction voting a little bit. I just wanted to make sure we're thumbs up on any questions so far. Any clarifications needed?
Yeah, there's at least one quick question. Yeah.
I was just wondering, are you going to talk about like examples that this has been used in?
Sure. Yeah. So there's only been one deployment of the common stack pattern. Um, there's lots of deployments that rhyme with this, but the specific mechanisms that we're talking about here have been deployed in the Token Engineering Commons. So that was the first augmented bonding curve DAO with conviction voting. So if you follow the letter of these mechanisms, there's been one deployment, but I would argue there's actually many different deployments that are very similar. And although they may not call themselves this, I think we can still learn a lot from those deployments and where they succeed and where they fail, and where they're, whether it's a governance failure or an economic failure or even smart contract failure. There's so many different ways there can be glitches in these systems. So I think it's really important, even though we're talking about specific mechanisms, to keep a very broad view across the ecosystem and learn what works and what doesn't, and apply them to this toolkit as well.
Okay, cool.
There's
Yeah,
any
and
other
then the
that answer the
follow-up on
question?
that, yeah, that did. And the follow-up to that is there either a canonical sort of example of like what this style of governance can be applied towards that traditional systems don't work for?
Right. So actually, I think that's a very wide question because I think there are a ton of different contexts that can be suited with different governance and economic tools. And I have a feeling we 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 flatten a lot of these assumptions in traditional economics, and I think the new affordances of these tools kind of blurs the lines between things like currency or money, equities, and credits like use credits. I think tokens can kind of blend all of these things into one in new ways. So I have a feeling there is a very large design space for a very large number of contexts, and I think all we can do at this point is say, hey, here's a specific problem. Here are some mechanisms that can address those problems. Did it work? Did it not? How can we improve? Maybe in time we'll come up with sort of like classes of problems that can be addressed with certain contextualized solutions or certain components, these different puzzle pieces, but arranged in different ways to suit different contexts. So I have a feeling we could probably identify a lot of different areas and different ways these things could be used, and maybe I'll get into a few of those presentations. So if you uh, I'm happy to continue, and maybe we'll get some more idea of what context these can be applied in once we start talking about the mechanisms in particular.
Cool. Okay, sounds good. So those four puzzle pieces are all the organs, and you talk about it now.
Right. So I'll go in particular into two that we've focused on the most. But yes, you're right. They're sort of the oops, where am I? They're the organs that we talked about earlier. So here's the bonding curve is kind of the heart. Conviction voting is kind of the brain. Giveth is kind of the stomach. And actually, the dashboard we didn't show here, but that's kind of the what would that be? If we're familiar with Stafford Beer's viable systems model, maybe that's another rabbit hole. But he proposed five sort of like layers of abstraction in a system, and system 4 and system 5 are sort of the like identity or the systemic awareness of what's going on in any given viable system. And a viable system could be as small as a cell, or it could be a human, or it could be society is another form of viable system. So it's just a way of looking at a system and its component parts. And the analytics dashboard would be more sort of the systemic or holistic identity of that organism. So as a DAO member, how do I show up in the DAO and say, okay, how much are we spending? What value is being produced? Who's earning that value? What code has been produced? So it's sort of the God's eye view of this organism and what's coming in, what's coming out, what are the flows in between. So I apologize if I added more rabbit holes to that answer than needed. But the VSM model from Stafford Beer is definitely something worth checking out for anyone interested.
Great, thank you. Maybe I don't know, more like a observation when you go back to that previous slide with the organs. It's like you're creating the governance for something that isn't for humans. It's for like systems or artificial intelligence systems.
So the idea behind this would be more collective intelligence than artificial intelligence. So, I mean, in the same way that we consider ourselves individuals, but we are actually collectives of cells, bacteria, viruses. Like we are more non-human matter than we are human matter. Actually, there's more non-human cells in a human body than there are human DNA, cells based on human DNA. So we are a collective. So if you think of the human individual as a cell in the human collective, you kind of get this different fractal layer. So we're talking about this system is a community that is composed of cells that are humans. So each individual human acts in the system, and together we act in a way. So this comes. I don't know if anyone has read Marx when he talked about economies as metabolisms, very similar to that. So we're kind of talking about the societal scale or the community scale collective organism that, or maybe an ant colony is a good example as well. an individual ant, can only tell us so much. But when you look at the whole colony, you see these patterns that are really quite interesting and emergent. And this is the same thing with murmurations, birds flocking. An individual bird within a flock is just following very simple rules. Don't run into another bird, maintain speed, maintain direction, etc. But then when you zoom out and you look at all of the birds, you get complex emergent behavior from simple individual actions. So we're kind of looking at like a meta collective of humans forming this sort of like social organism when we're talking about this. Does that make sense?
Fantastic. Thanks for the explanation.
Cool. Great, good questions as well. So some of this now gets into rabbit hole territory. So if there's some of this that is, too complex or mathematical, feel free to, I'm happy to answer some questions, but there's a lot of kind of deeper threads here that we can pull at, and I'm happy to pull some of those into after this session as well, because I think there's a ton we can get into. And actually, one other question: what's our time? So I've got a 25-minute hard stop, and I'm happy to go. I probably have too many slides here, so I can skip through a few and take more questions. But is 20 minutes ish okay, or do you guys have another presenter or anything coming on?
Yeah, that's right. But we have like a 15-minute buffer after and before each talk. So if you go a little bit over, then we just have less time for questions. But that's up to you.
So we have approximately 25 minutes, yes.
Yeah.
All together.
Perfect.
I mean, yeah.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so diving into the augmented bonding curve as the first sort of, here we go, as the first component of the Common Stack toolkit. So what is the augmented bonding curve? We also call it a commons market maker. For you guys who know what AMMs are, automated market makers like Uniswap or Curve or Balancer, similar to that, except instead of providing secondary market exchange liquidity, you're actually creating the token and redeeming the token. So you're issuing, minting, and burning the token whenever collateral or dollars or DAI is put into. So you can kind of think of it like an ATM or like a vending machine. You put in dollars, it issues the token and gives it to you. When you give the token back, it burns the token and gives you your dollars back. So it's sort of a way to regulate an economy. And if you think of it sort of like semi-permeable membranes, similar to osmosis in physical systems, that the bonding curve is kind of like the cell wall. So value can transmit into the economy and out of the economy through this bonding curve. So it's sort of a primary market maker, a primary AMM. Actually, there's some terminology I'm trying to get out there, that there's primary AMMs and secondary AMMs. And secondary AMMs is Uniswap and Balancer and Curve. Primary AMMs would be like, or even TrueBit or Nexus Mutual. There's lots of different examples out there where you essentially put Ethereum into a smart contract and it issues you TrueBit or Nexus or NXM. When you put your NXM back into that bonding curve or smart contract, it releases your Ethereum. So this is a primary issuance AMM as opposed to a secondary exchange AMM. Happy to take some questions on that if there are particular questions, but I can also keep moving and take a few at the end of the session on bonding curves. So the idea is that capital comes in, there is the reserve pool or the collateral that's backing the price of the token, but you also have this funding pool or common pool that is used to fund proposals, and then value is produced, code is produced, whatever that community is creating an economy for. So an engine for public goods funding. So the point isn't that the price of your token has to go up, which is a constant narrative in the Web3 space today. If price goes up, good. If price goes down, bad. I think that's kind of missing the point. Actually, I've got a slide here. So if we think of the token price going up and going down as just sort of a secondary factor. But the primary point of these systems is to produce money for the common pool. So the whole idea with the commons market maker is that, the price goes up, good, the price goes down. It's not the end of the world, because the price, if this community is producing value, then this is just a market signal for more investment in that community. So the price can go up, the price can go down, the price can go back up, the price can go back down, as long as the common pool is getting filled. And every time there's volatility between this price going up and price going down, you have the common pool getting filled with discretionary treasury that can be allocated by the members of the community. So you can kind of think of this like a hydroelectric dam. You have some inflows of investment, you have some outflows of divestment, but the most important thing is that energy is being produced and being fed into the common pool through the sort of electricity generation, if we want to use that analogy. So you can kind of see how, actually, I don't know if I should get totally into this. The interesting thing about these systems as well is they act like a low-pass filter or a volatility dampener on the price of tokens. So this is just some live market validation that we see. Essentially, the secondary market price is the Uniswap price, the blue line here, and the orange line is the primary price on the primary automated market maker. So what was happening here was that the price on Uniswap was trying to pump. There was a big FOMO event over this token. Everybody suddenly wanted to buy it for no reason. But instead of going straight up, you can see it was smoothed out over this whole interval by the interaction between the primary and the secondary markets. Of course, you do see a dump here, and I would say this is because of the system design parameters they chose, that the buy curve and the sell curve are so far apart. If this green curve were set much closer to that orange curve, you would have seen this drop get caught and smoothed out like you see on the upside. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities for these tools to act as price volatility dampeners, and also sort of economic efficiency gains, sort of like regenerative braking in an electric vehicle. When you brake in an e-car, the newer cars anyway will take that thermal energy and that friction, the heat generated off that, and feed it back into power the battery. So we're kind of doing that sort of thing with the system as well. So the whole idea behind it, as you can see in this quick loopy diagram, is that price isn't actually the most important thing in these systems anymore. It's actually the amount in your funding or your common pool. So the tokens can be minted, the tokens can be burned, the price will go up and go down. But the most important thing is that the discretionary funding, the money used to create open source code, is continually flowing into this community, so that work can still be funded and outcomes can be produced. So how does that work actually? In this system, it's through, and I mean, these are still simple one token ecosystems, which I think is fine for where we're at, but I think in the future we will definitely be seeing more sophisticated multi-token ecosystems. But at least in the space we're at today, it's quite interesting to combine sort of these two different utility values to a token. So one is you can redeem this token for the dollars that are backing it. So some people may want to sell the token and reclaim or claim some profits. Great. So if the price gets really high, we'll see some people, we'll see some sell pressure as people try to reclaim capital from the collateral pool. But as people are selling, the treasury is filling up. And those tokens have a second utility in allocating that treasury. So let's say I'm the last token holder. Everyone else has left the DAO but me. In a traditional DAO, I would be called the bag holder. I'm, holding all of these worthless tokens. Nobody wants them. I'm the last one here. I'm screwed. But in this system, because I'm the last person holding tokens, I have 100% control over the discretionary treasury. And since everyone else just left, and they paid an exit tribute on every exit, so 90%, let's say, of their withdrawal goes to them, and 10% goes to fill the funding pool. Now I'm the last person holding tokens, so I get to control the entire funding pool. So there's this sort of opposing buy pressure, because as more people see, or people who believe in this community see that, hey, this treasury is filling up and no one wants to govern it. Well, there's a utility for them to jump in and buy that token. So you have sell pressure from one utility reclaiming the collateral behind the token, but you have buy pressure from another utility because that token can also be used to allocate your collective treasury. So you have sort of a volatility between these two utilities. You have people buying, you have people selling, and that volatility creates continuous funding for the community to continue producing whatever it is they value: open source code, apples, healthcare, etc. So, quick summary on Commons market makers. Essentially, they can provide guaranteed liquidity for issuance and redemption or buy and sell of a token. This allows us to move beyond sort of static economies and towards dynamic breathing economies. So, economies can grow if the demand for their services increases, and economies can also shrink and do so in a healthy way, which is very starkly contrasted to their current system, where it doesn't seem like our systems are able to shrink. They have to grow. They have to grow to service their debt, and thus we have this sort of like never-ending growth imperative that's threatening life on this planet. So I think we need to figure out how to create economies that can healthily expand, but also healthily contract in the case that their sort of productivity or usefulness is winding down. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities with these tools there. Also, I showed briefly that one graphic, but I think these tools offer some really interesting volatility dampening, sort of like a parachute. If you can picture the price ticker on a any given token, these tools are almost like if the price ticker tries to go too high or too low fast, it almost has like a parachute pulling it back. And that's the interesting sort of arbitrage opportunity between the primary and secondary market, but also the frictions that any community can impose, like entry taxes, exit taxes, etc. I mean, it really creates an interesting sort of hydraulic damper. It's almost like shock absorbers in a vehicle that these tools give that same property. As I mentioned, sort of the breathing token supply allows us to move towards potentially more dynamic and adaptive economies. And it also produces continuous funding for a community treasury in whatever that community decides to do. And of course, there needs to be some core value production in these systems. It's not just a financial system, it is actually a value production system that is supported by these new financial tools. So maybe I'll take a moment there and see if there's any questions on that. And maybe, yeah, I guess we'll see how many questions, and maybe I'll just stop with that component, or if there's more interest in conviction voting and how that is sort of a biomimetic decision-making system, I'm happy to go into that as well. But I'll pause for some questions.
Hey, so I kind of have two questions that kind of like double down on your biomimetic metaphors. The first one is about kind of communities and how they develop around these kind of tools. What I've noticed in my own endeavors is that, like, if you want to take the mycelium metaphor, the activation energy for nodes in our networks is quite high. And that means that you end up having like little clusters of like lots of activity, but like most of the network isn't actually participating. So do you have any thoughts on how to like reduce the required activation energy, so to speak?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I know what you're saying in terms of like in any given DAO, there's probably, well, depending on the size of the DAO, of course, but maybe 5 to 10% of the people are like actively producing value, and 90 to 95% of people, and maybe there's a bit more granularity there. There's I feel like it's concentric circles, right? You have your core crew of value producers in a group, then you have kind of the close collaborator, or maybe a little bit more distant collaborators, and then you have majority of lurkers or investors or people who are there but they're not really providing value in their is that sort of what you're alluding to in these communities?
Yeah. So that is kind of what I'm alluding to.
Cool. So in that case, I think these tools actually create an interesting um, separation of those two different, because in my mind, a lot of the problem of DAOs today is everyone is lumped together. They say, hey, you're a token holder, you're in. But actually, this opens the doors to value extraction in a lot of ways, especially when you can purchase governance with dollars. I mean, I'm sure some of you have seen the Steemit takeover by Justin Sun from the Tron ecosystem. He moved in, he bought a whack of tokens, and then said, oh, I'm going to start changing all the parameters of the system because I now have tokens to vote to do that. So not only is lack of participation an issue, but also sort of governance malicious takeovers and so on. And I have a feeling we can use these tools to sort of segregate value producers into their own like class, and then everyone else can support the value producers. They can become a value producer themselves if they want to, but I think we need to create sort of a limited action set where speculators or distant community can buy the token, they can like hold the token, they can redeem the token for value in whatever way that community defines value. But we need to create a special place for value producers to be able to claim the value of their labor, as opposed to everyone else who's just kind of like speculating on or wants access to the fruits of that labor. And I think there's some interesting ways we can set up these tools so that there are sort of like the core value just to speculate or be a lurker or whatnot. I mean, they still can, but they don't have the same financial privilege in this economic system as the value producers do. And that's not to be discriminatory because anyone can produce value, but you just have to do it in order to receive the financial benefit for it. So I think this is an interesting way to separate the value producers in a system from the people who appreciate that value production or people who would extract some of that value from the community, which we see in, whenever capitalism touches a cooperative or the commons. I think there's this interface point is really difficult in the real world, and I think these new tools will allow us to create interesting new joints between my local community purpose-driven currency and the US dollar, for example, or DAI or any other representation of it. So it is a tricky problem, absolutely, and I don't think we can expect to see like 100% voter participation. I just don't think that's realistic. But I think there's a lot of interesting ways, especially with liquid democracy or delegated token systems, that we can get a better collective signal, but while also giving primacy to value producers in the system rather than value extractors. We need to kind of put them at a lower tier and say, hey, you can play here, but you can't extract value willy-nilly.
So I had a question, but I feel like what you're talking about just now kind of points towards the answer quite a bit, which was that like the body metaphor again, right? Like if you put calories into a body, you can only get so much work out of that body. You can only get so much value out of that body, and like a lot of the mechanisms that you were describing, like the volatility dampening mechanisms, from a certain perspective, they can look extractive, right? They can look like they are reducing the amount of value available for value creation or useful work or something. So I was thinking, like, is that really the best way to go about things? But then if you think about it as a body, it's like it's doing work, and that's where the value comes from.
Right. And I think honestly, there's probably different contexts where there's no one system that is the right system. I think that's important to clarify as well, that each system can only be built in the context for which it is useful. And there's probably a lot of different configurations and parameterizations of these systems such that they serve a purpose. And I think as people launching DAOs, we need to be continually, sort of measuring. There's a concept called Wittgenstein's ruler, where, the first time you use a ruler, you don't know if you're using the ruler to measure the table or the table to measure the ruler. It doesn't, until you use that ruler a lot, or you come up with some, standard of rulers, like this ruler is 30 centimeters or this ruler is a meter. Until you do that, you're really just comparing sort of co-fitness rather than, or maybe co-fitness is the wrong word, but you're only understanding the relative measure of that versus anything else you hold it up against. So we need to continually, I think, hold these DAOs up to sort of the standard of what is actually being produced here. Is that valuable? And who is able to share in that value? Is that value being extracted away by foreign investors at multinational banks? Or is that value being shared among a local economy of, Chama participants in rural Kenya? So there's very different sort of contextualized designs that could fit in a lot of different situations, but I don't think there's any one right answer for how these systems can be set up.
Yeah, so I have another, a question that is more like we have learners in this ecosystem who have no clue about blockchains or tokens or anything like that. Do you think it's possible to summarize the whole concept for a 5-year-old or for somebody who really doesn't have any any pre-knowledge about how blockchains and tokens and stuff like that work?
I can do my best in the 4 minutes we've got. That's definitely a big question. Um, so if I could summarize it, why are blockchains so useful? Um, currently, sure. I think, I mean, a lot of people say blockchains aren't much better than databases. And that's true as long as you trust the person maintaining the database. So one of the big problems in the world today is that most of our data is held in these massive corporate silos. That, I don't own any of my data. I mean, a lot of companies may say you own your data. You can download your data from us, for example, but they really have all of the power, all of the control. So when I interact with you on Facebook, I'm not actually interacting with you. I'm interacting with Facebook. You are also interacting with Facebook. So there's an intermediary that is a corporation whose goal is to make money through advertising. And that can get corrupted. So all of a sudden you introduce an attack vector. When I'm just trying to talk to Nina on a social media platform, suddenly both of our data is monetized and we could be being fed misinformation from state-sponsored hackers. And this happens, right? This is Cambridge Analytica. This has affected global political movements for the past number of years, and it's terrifying. So what a blockchain does is it offers to disintermediate that whoever controls the database. So the idea is we all control the database. So everyone who participates in Bitcoin, for example, runs a version of the Bitcoin ledger. And all versions of the Bitcoin ledger have to agree, and then they say, okay, this is our global shared truth. So it's kind of disintermediating that corporate middleman or government middleman, or the same thing in our economy. When I want to transact with Nina, I have to use a Canadian dollar or a US dollar or these weird things that are issued by someone else, and then I had to earn them by participating in what we could call modern wage slavery. And then I give them to Nina, and she also has to, provide labor for that. So I think what the opportunity that these systems really offer is self-sovereign. Um, I'll say currency, but it doesn't have to be traditional, like money as we know it. But any form of value tracking, we can now do this in ways that we've never before been able to do. It's kind of like the first time the printing press was want to say open source, but I don't think that's what you'd call it. Before that, books, even literacy was a guarded good. Only the clerics could read, and only the clerics could write, and only the state or the church had the ability to print the book, the Bible, and the laws, which was the only things that were printed. And everyone else was basically just disenfranchised from that opportunity. After the printing press, became freely available, look at the infinity of literary opportunity we have explored as a species that was not available to us before that technology. So I think like blockchains are kind of like the printing press, but for economic systems or coordination systems, even more so. How can we, in a self-sovereign way, issue and redeem credits that are good for our labor? And I think this will basically create a economic renaissance over the coming decades, in similar ways that we saw, with the birth of the printing press or the birth of the internet. We just have now sort of like an economic layer that can sit on top of that, or even within that, in a new way that has never been possible before.
Do we have any additional questions? Because we are, running a bit late with the next talk.
Yeah, we're right on time.
Yeah.
So I've got to run. I've got another call coming up, and I'm sorry if there were more questions. I'd be very happy to continue this discussion. Maybe if there's any other questions, we can continue some conversations in the Discord. If you have a particular channel or anything like that, I'd be happy to share the presentation and answer any further questions.
Absolutely. Alex will connect you to our chat. And you are actually in. Here we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Like I'm super sad that we couldn't listen to the rest of it. So maybe we'll have to schedule another one at some point in the future. Hopefully not too far in the future. And otherwise, I mean, now you're already on the correct Discord server, and we have even some channels that are titled a name that is similar to these kind of topics. So yeah, it would be cool to keep in touch and finish the rest of it at some point. Thank you very much.
Agreed. Thanks so much. Yeah, looking forward to. I see there's a channel called Commons, so I'll maybe drop the slides in the deck, and if anyone wants to peruse through further, I probably only got about halfway through, and some of that may be a rabbit hole, but happy to take questions in the chat if there's further interest.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff. Have fun.
Yeah, have
Thanks,
fun.
guys. Good to see. Where are you right now? By the way, I want to come in person next time.
Yeah, we are in Wales, in the Astral ship. That's like a church turned into a pirate ship, but we're doing like basically some sort of event like this once every year, but not during the pandemic. So last time we did it was in Chiang Mai, and I think you were there in person, if I remember.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the follow-up from that. But like next year we'll do another one. If you have a preferred location, let us know. Maybe we can do that.
Cool. I'll keep you posted. South Africa is one of my favorite countries, and also affordable, beautiful, and wonderful people too. So I might be there in 2023. Maybe we can cross paths.
Sweet. So we'll consider that. Thank you.
Have fun.
Good to see you guys. We'll chat again soon.
Yeah.